the fire that destroyed the Harrow Plantation on the night of August 14th. 1859 burned with such intensity that witnesses later swore they could see its orange glow from nearly 12 miles away. By the time dawn broke, the property was reduced to ash, with only the blackened skeletons of 3 structures still standing. 17 people lost their lives that night, 16 enslaved laborers and 1 white overseer. The official report submitted by the county sheriff 3 days later concluded that the fire had been caused by a lantern accidentally knocked over in a tobacco barn. But among the enslaved survivors, a very different account circulated, shared only in hushed voices and never written down. Their version involved a young deaf man named Thomas, a vicious overseer called Virgil Crenshaw, and a chain of events so deliberate and so precisely carried out that historians still argue over what truly occurred. What most of them agree on, however, is this: the fire was no accident. Someone planned it. Someone wanted those people dead. And someone walked away that night without a single burn on their skin. Before we continue with the story of Thomas and the night that altered everything, let me ask you something. If you're listening from the South or from anywhere in America where these old plantations still stand, leave a comment and tell me which state you're listening from. These stories are part of our shared history, as uncomfortable as they may be. And I want to know where you're hearing this from. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because the story you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you understood about justice, revenge, and survival. Now, let's return to Virginia in 1859, to a place where cruelty was written into law and silence became the deadliest weapon of all. The Harrow Plantation sat in Virginia's Tidewater region, roughly 40 miles south of Richmond, in a county where the James River fractured into dozens of narrow tributaries that fed the surrounding marshlands and tobacco fields. This was old Virginia country, first settled in the early 18th century by English families who had crossed the Atlantic chasing wealth in the New World. By 1859, the land had been worked continuously for more than 100 years. In some places the soil was exhausted, in others still fertile, creating a patchwork of productivity that determined which families prospered and which slipped slowly into genteel decline. The Harrow family occupied the middle ground of that spectrum. They were not powerful dynasties like the Randolphs or the Carters, families who controlled thousands of acres and owned hundreds of enslaved people, but neither were they poor. Edmund Harrow's grandfather had purchased a land in 1732 using profits from a shipping venture based in Norfolk. He built the main house himself, or more accurately, he oversaw the enslaved laborers who built it. It was a modest 2-story structure of brick and timber, painted white, with a wide porch facing east to catch the morning light and the evening breeze drifting up from a river. The plantation covered roughly 300 acres, with about half of that under cultivation at any given time. The remainder was either logged for timber or simply left to revert to the pine forests and marshlands that had dominated the region before European settlement. Tobacco was the primary crop, though corn, wheat, and vegetables were also grown in smaller plots closer to the slave quarters. Behind the main house stood an orchard of apple and peach trees, along with a small vineyard that Edmund's father had planted during a burst of optimism that never quite paid off. The grapes survived, but they were sour and thin-skinned, better suited for vinegar than wine. In 1859, the plantation was worked by 23 enslaved people ranging in age from 6 to 62. They lived in 6 cabins arranged in 2 rows behind tobacco barns, each cabin housing between 3 and 5 people, depending on family size. The cabins were built from rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, with dirt floors that turned slick and muddy after heavy rain. Wooden shutters replaced glass windows. Each cabin had a single fireplace used for both cooking and warmth, and a low loft where children slept on straw-filled mattresses. Compared to many plantations in the region, the enslaved community at Harrow was relatively stable. Edmund Harrow was not inclined to sell people away from their families unless he faced severe financial pressure. That had happened only once, in 1851, when a failed tobacco harvest combined with poor investments forced him to sell 3 young men to a trader bound for the Deep South. The memory of that sale lingered painfully in the quarters. The sound of mothers crying out, the sight of men chained together and marched down the road toward Richmond. It served as a brutal reminder that their lives were never truly their own, that everything familiar could be ripped away without warning by forces entirely beyond their control. For the most part, though, life at Harrow Plantation followed a predictable rhythm. The work was grueling. Tobacco demanded constant labor from planting in April through harvest in September, but it was no harsher than the work required on neighboring plantations. Food rations were sufficient if repetitive. Cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, and whatever vegetables people managed to grow in their small personal plots. Clothing was issued twice a year, in spring and fall. Men received 2 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, 1 jacket, and 1 pair of shoes. Women were given 2 dresses, a shawl, and a single pair of shoes. Children wore cast-offs until they were old enough to work in the fields themselves. Edmund Harrow was a widower in his late 50s. His wife had died in childbirth 20 years earlier, along with the infant son who would have been his only heir. He never remarried, whether because of lingering devotion to his wife or because he had simply lost interest in the complications of domestic life. Most of his time was spent in Richmond, where he owned a townhouse on Gray Street and held a seat on the board of a small local bank. He visited the plantation once a month, sometimes less, to review the books and inspect the crops. By the standards of his era and environment, he was not considered a cruel man, but neither was he kind. He viewed slavery primarily as an economic system, perhaps regrettable, but necessary. He treated the enslaved people on his land the same way he treated his horses and farming equipment, as valuable assets that needed to be kept in working condition. The day-to-day operation of the plantation was left to the overseer, and for the 2 years before Virgil Crenshaw arrived, that overseer had been a man named William Porter, a local farmer. Porter was the son of a local farmer, a capable but largely unambitious man. He managed to keep the plantation functioning without major disruption, but tobacco yields declined year after year, and Edmund Harrow's patience wore thin. In the spring of 1857, he dismissed Porter and hired Crenshaw instead, acting on the recommendation of a planter in the neighboring county, who was eager to be rid of him but too courteous to admit it outright. Virgil Crenshaw was 32 years old when he arrived at Harrow Plantation. He was tall and wiry, with pale blue eyes and a face that seemed permanently set against smiling. Born in North Carolina, he was the youngest son of a small farmer who lost his land to debt when Crenshaw was 15. Over the next decade and a half, Crenshaw worked his way up from field labor to overseer, drifting from plantation to plantation across Virginia and the Carolinas, rarely remaining in one place longer than 2 years. There was always an explanation for his departures: a disagreement with an owner, an incident involving enslaved workers, a sudden need to seek employment elsewhere, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to look closely. Wherever Crenshaw went, ruin followed. Among enslaved communities throughout the region, his name was already known. That reputation moved faster than he did, carried through the hidden communication networks that existed beneath the surface of plantation life. Whisper exchanges at Sunday markets, messages relayed by traveling preachers and hired-out laborers, songs whose lyrics encoded warnings and hard-earned knowledge. The story said that Crenshaw relished his authority, that he took pleasure in domination, that he viewed the people under his control not as human beings, but as animals to be broken and trained. When he arrived at Harrow Plantation in April of 1857, Crenshaw spent his first week doing almost nothing that could be called work. He walked the fields, inspected the barns and outbuildings, studied the plantation ledgers, and above all, watched the people. He noted who worked diligently and who slowed when they thought no one was looking, who held influence in the quarters and who stood alone, who had family ties that could be leveraged and who had no one to protect them. He was meticulous, storing these observations away to later build a system of control rooted in fear, manipulation, and carefully calculated violence. His first official act as overseer was to summon all the enslaved workers to a meeting on a Sunday afternoon. They gathered in the open yard between the tobacco barns, men, women, and children standing under the spring sun, while Crenshaw addressed him from the porch of his small cottage. His voice was even, almost casual, but there was a sharpness beneath it that made people uneasy. "My name is Virgil Crenshaw," he said. "I'm the new overseer here. I want a few things understood from the start. I don't care what the rules were before I arrived. Those rules no longer apply. From now on, you follow my rules. They're simple. You work hard, you work fast, and you don't cause me trouble. Do those things, and we'll get along. Fail to do them, and you'll regret it. I don't make empty threats, and I don't give second chances. Do we understand each other?" No one replied. They stood in silence, exhausted and wary, knowing that any response could be twisted into defiance. Crenshaw's lips curved into a thin, joyless smile that never touched his eyes. "Good," he said. "Now go back to your cabins. Tomorrow we start fresh." That night, inside their cabins, the enslaved people of Harrow Plantation spoke quietly about the new overseer. They had seen men like him before, men who treated cruelty as a point of pride. They knew what usually followed: heavier workloads, arbitrary punishments, and an atmosphere of constant scrutiny and dread. What they did not yet know was just how far Crenshaw would go, or how long they would be forced to endure him. Within 6 months, the plantation had been completely reshaped. Crenshaw reorganized the labor system, dividing the enslaved people into work gangs based on age and physical strength. Each group was assigned specific tasks with rigid daily quotas. Failure to meet those quotas brought punishment: reduced rations, additional labor, or confinement in the plantation jail, a narrow, windowless shed behind the overseer's cottage. For more serious offenses, talking back, attempting to flee, fighting with another enslaved person, the consequences were harsher. Crenshaw was careful, however, never to injure anyone so severely that they could not continue working. He understood that his value to Edmund Harrove lay in extracting the maximum amount of labor while keeping financial losses to a minimum. What truly set Crenshaw apart, though, was not his use of physical force, but his mastery of psychological manipulation. He had an uncanny ability to identify each person's weak points and exploit them with precision. He knew who had children they would sacrifice anything to protect, who had lovers they could not bear to see harmed, whose pride could be shattered, and whose fragile hope could be extinguished. Using this knowledge, he cultivated an environment of fear and suspicion, where people were afraid to help one another, afraid to show vulnerability, and terrified of doing anything that might draw his attention. One of his favorite methods was turning people against each other. He would tell one person that another had informed on them, whether it was true or not, and then stand back as mistrust and bitterness destroyed friendships and even families. At other times, he granted small privileges to selected individuals: an extra portion of food, a lighter assignment, permission to visit a spouse on a nearby plantation. He made sure everyone else knew about these favors, sowing envy and resentment. He also punished entire groups for the actions of a single individual, forcing people to monitor and discipline one another out of fear of collective retribution. Under Crenshaw's control, tobacco production rose sharply. In his first full year, 1858, the plantation yielded nearly 30% more tobacco than it had the previous season. Edmund Harrove was pleased. He rewarded Crenshaw with a bonus and encouraged him to continue exactly as he was. He never asked how those results were achieved. He did not want to know. There was, however, one person on the plantation whom Crenshaw could not fully read. One individual who seemed untouched by his usual strategies. This person did not react with visible fear or open defiance, but instead observed him with a calm, deliberate awareness that Crenshaw found unsettling. That person was Thomas. Thomas had been born on the Harrow Plantation in the spring of 1841, the son of a woman named Ruth who worked in the main house as a cook. His father was unknown. Ruth had never spoken to him, and no one had ever pressed her for answers. In the world of slavery, questions of paternity were often dangerous, capable of triggering violence, forced separation, or worse. What mattered was that Thomas was Ruth's son, and she loved him with a fierce, protected devotion that only deepened as the years passed. Thomas had been deaf since birth, the result of a fever Ruth suffered during the final months of her pregnancy. She had been working in the main house kitchen, standing over a blazing stove in the middle of July, when she collapsed. The plantation doctor, a white physician from Richmond who visited once a month, diagnosed heat exhaustion and advised rest. But rest was a luxury Ruth could not afford. She had duties to perform, and failure meant replacement. She returned to work the next day, and the day after that, while the fever lingered, low and unrelenting, until Thomas was born 6 weeks later. He was a small infant, unusually quiet and still. For the first few days, Ruth was certain he would not survive. But he did. He grew stronger with each passing day, until it became clear that he was healthy in every respect but one. He could not hear. Ruth noticed it when he was around 3 months old. Loud noises did not startle him. He did not turn his head when she called his name. He did not cry when other babies in the quarters cried. At first, she told herself he was simply calm, different. But by 6 months, there was no denying it. Thomas was deaf. In some places, at some times, a deaf child might have been viewed as useless, someone unable to contribute labor, and therefore without value. But Ruth was valuable. She was an exceptional cook, relied upon by Edmund Hurrell's father to prepare meals for visiting guests of importance. Because of that, Thomas was allowed to live and grow up in the quarters like any other child. Ruth made certain he learned to work, to be useful, so that no one could claim he was a burden. As a small child, Thomas developed his own way of communicating. He could not hear words, but he could see faces and read intent through movement and expression. Ruth and Thomas built a shared language of gestures. Simple at first, pointing and nodding and shaking their heads, but growing more complex as he aged. By the time he was 5, they could hold entire conversations using only their hands and faces. Others in the quarters picked up some signs as well, enough to exchange basic information. Thomas, meanwhile, learned to read lips with remarkable precision, studying the movement of mouths and understanding what was being said even without hearing the sound. His deafness shaped his life in unexpected ways. Because he could not hear shouted commands across open fields, he was assigned to work closer to the main buildings, in the tobacco barns, curing sheds, carpenter's shop, and blacksmith's forge. Often he worked alone or alongside only 1 or 2 others, giving him a degree of independence unusual for someone enslaved. It also placed him in the middle of conversations people assumed he could not understand. White men, in particular, spoke freely around him, believing that deafness meant ignorance. They were wrong. Over time, Thomas learned to be still and observant. He watched faces, read lips, noted posture and movement. Even without hearing tone, he could see it in the stiffness of shoulders, the tightening of jaws, the way hands clenched or relaxed. He absorbed things other enslaved people never learned. Secrets spoken openly because people forgot he was there or assumed he could not comprehend. By the summer of 1859, when Thomas was 18, he had grown into a young man of average height with his mother's sharp cheekbones and dark eyes, his body lean and strong from years of labor. He had inherited Ruth's intelligence as well, along with something harder to define, a patient watchfulness, an ability to observe and wait and think before acting. Thomas rarely smiled, but when he did, it transformed his face, making him appear younger and more vulnerable than he usually seemed. Virgil Crenshaw had tried during his early months at the plantation to break Thomas, as he broke everyone else. He assigned him pointless, exhausting tasks, moving piles of bricks from one end of the yard to the other, then back again, purely to assert dominance. He withheld Thomas's food rations, accusing him of stealing from the kitchen despite knowing the charge was false. He threatened to sell Ruth to a plantation in Georgia, fully aware that the fear of separation was one of the most powerful tools an overseer possessed. Thomas endured it all. He moved the bricks, every last one, twice without protest. He went 3 days without food, without showing weakness. And when Crenshaw threatened to sell his mother, Thomas met his gaze directly, his expression neither submissive nor defiant, only watchful, patient, waiting. The look unsettled Crenshaw in a way he could not explain. There was something in Thomas's silence, in the way he seemed to see everything without reacting, that made the overseer feel exposed, as if the young man could see past his cruelty to the insecure, violent core beneath. Crenshaw knew how to handle defiance. He had crushed it many times before, but Thomas was not defiant. He was something else entirely. He was calculating, and that made him dangerous. The incident that changed everything occurred on a Tuesday afternoon in late July, during the most brutal stretch of summer. Temperatures had hovered above 90 degrees for more than a week, and the air was so heavy with humidity it felt difficult to breathe, difficult to think, difficult to do anything but endure. The tobacco plants drooped despite regular watering, and the enslaved workers moved slowly through their tasks, conserving energy, fighting collapse. That afternoon, Thomas was working inside the tobacco barn, hanging leaves for curing. It was punishing work. The barn trapped heat like an oven, the air inside far hotter than outside, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of curing tobacco. Smell of tobacco. Even so, Thomas preferred the barn to the open fields. Inside, he could work at his own pace, and he was usually alone, which meant he didn't have to worry about Crenshaw watching him constantly, criticizing every movement, inventing faults where none existed. He was standing on a ladder near the back of the barn, reaching up to hang a bundled armful of tobacco leaves on one of the high curing racks, when he noticed movement near the doorway. He glanced down and saw Crenshaw step inside, followed closely by a young woman named Sarah. Sarah was 19 years old, the daughter of the plantation's blacksmith Jacob, one of the most respected men in the enslaved community. She had inherited her father's strength and his quiet dignity. She was 7 months pregnant, her belly rounded beneath the loose dress she wore, and she moved with the careful, deliberate gait of a woman carrying a heavy weight. Her husband, Daniel, worked in the fields and would not return until sunset. Thomas watched as Crenshaw closed the barn door behind them. Something in the overseer's posture, something in the tightness of his movements and the set of his face, made Thomas's stomach clench with unease. He froze on a ladder, partially concealed by the hanging tobacco leaves, and watched. Crenshaw said something to Sarah. From where Thomas stood, he couldn't clearly see the man's lips, but he could see Sarah's face. And what he saw there sent a chill through him. She looked frightened. She stepped backward, instinctively moving toward the door, but Crenshaw shifted his body to block her path. He said something else. This time Thomas could make out fragments of the words as Crenshaw spoke slowly, deliberately. "Watching you. Oh, me." Showing gratitude. "Light work because of your condition." Sarah shook her head. Her hands moved instinctively to shield her swollen belly. She said something in reply, but Thomas couldn't read her lips clearly because she had turned partly away. Whatever she said, it enraged Crenshaw. His jaw tightened. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough that Thomas could see the pressure whitening her skin. Thomas didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to think. He climbed down from the ladder as quietly as possible, his feet finding each rung by memory, his eyes never leaving Crenshaw and Sarah. When he reached the ground, he crossed the barn floor, his steps silent on the packed dirt, and tapped Crenshaw on the shoulder. Crenshaw spun around, startled, his hand still clamped around Sarah's arm. For a moment, the three of them stood there in the dusty, amber light filtering to the barn slats. The overseer, the pregnant woman, and the deaf young man who had interrupted something that could have ended very badly. Thomas pointed to the ladder, then to the tobacco leaves hanging from the racks, then to Crenshaw. The meaning was obvious. He needed help with the work. It was a lie. Thomas didn't need help, but it gave Sarah the chance she needed. She twisted free of Crenshaw's grip and hurried toward the door. She didn't look back. Crenshaw stared at Thomas for a long moment, his pale blue eyes burning with restrained fury. Then he smiled, a thin, empty smile that never reached his eyes. He leaned in close, so close that Thomas could smell stale tobacco on his breath. could see the fine creases around his eyes and the rough stubble along his jaw. Crenshaw spoke slowly and clearly, shaping each word so Thomas could read his lips. "You just made a mistake, boy. A big one. And I'm going to make sure you regret it for the rest of your short life." Thomas didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady and unflinching. After a moment, Crenshaw straightened, turned, and walked out of the barn, leaving Thomas alone in the heat and silence. That night, Sarah came to Ruth's cabin. She was sobbing, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she signed to Thomas, thanking him over and over for what he had done. Ruth held her while she cried. Thomas sat on the dirt floor near the fireplace, watching the flames flicker and thinking about what was coming next. He knew Crenshaw would not let this go. Men like him never did. They couldn't afford to. Their authority depended on fear, and fear depended on the certainty that resistance, no matter how small, would always be punished. Thomas was right. Over the next 3 weeks, Crenshaw made good on his promise. The persecution began the very next morning. Thomas was assigned to clean out the plantation well, a task that was both dangerous and revolting. The well was nearly 30 feet deep, its stone walls slick with moss and algae. At the bottom lay 3 feet of stagnant water, beneath which had accumulated years of mud and debris, dead leaves, animal remains, broken tools, anything that had fallen in and never been retrieved. The water had begun to taste foul, and Edmund Hargrove had ordered it cleaned before his next visit. Thomas was lowered into the well inside a wooden bucket, a rope tied around his waist in case he slipped. The air at the bottom was cold, damp, and thick with the smell of decay. For hours, he worked in near darkness, scooping mud and refuse into buckets that were hauled up to surface. His hands went numb in the icy water. His back ached from bending in the cramped space. When he finally emerged at sunset, he was coated in filth and shaking violently despite the summer heat. The next day, Crenshaw sent him to repair the roof of the tobacco barn. It was dangerous work, made worse by the temperature. The tin roofing burned the skin on contact, and the pitch was steep enough that one misstep could send a man crashing 20 feet to the ground. Thomas worked carefully, replacing damaged boards and sealing gaps with tar, forcing himself not to think about how easy it would be to fall, and how convenient that would be for Crenshaw. The day after that, he was ordered to haul 100-pound sacks of grain from the storage shed to the mill, nearly half a mile away. He made the trip 20 times, each sack digging into his shoulders, his legs shaking with exhaustion. By the end of the day, he could barely stand. Through all of it, Crenshaw watched him with those cold blue eyes, waiting for a complaint, a stumble, a moment of weakness that would give him an excuse to escalate the punishment. But Thomas never gave him one. He completed every task, no matter how brutal or dangerous, without protest. He endured. Crenshaw wasn't satisfied with physical exhaustion alone. He wanted Thomas broken in spirit as well. He began cutting Thomas's food rations, accusing him of stealing from the kitchen. The accusation was false. Ruth would never have allowed it, and everyone in the quarters knew that. But truth didn't matter to Crenshaw. Truth. He cared about power, about proving that he could strip away even the most basic necessities of life on a whim. Thomas's rations were cut in half. Instead of a full pound of cornmeal and a quarter pound of salt pork each day, he received only half a pound of cornmeal and no meat at all. Ruth tried to give him part of her own food, but Thomas refused. He knew that if Crenshaw discovered it, Ruth would be punished as well, and he could not bear the thought of his mother's suffering because of him. He grew thinner. His face became hollow, his cheekbones sharper, his eyes sinking deeper into their sockets. Still, he kept working. He kept enduring. And he kept watching Crenshaw with that same patient, calculating gaze that made the overseer increasingly uneasy. The other enslaved people observed Thomas's punishment with a mixture of sympathy and fear. They knew what he had done. The story of how he had protected Sarah from Crenshaw spread quickly through the quarters. Many admired his courage, but admiration was tempered by dread. They understood the kind of man Crenshaw was, someone who would never stop, who would keep pushing until Thomas either broke or died. And they knew that stepping in would only make things worse, not just for Thomas, but for themselves as well. Sarah was consumed by guilt. She knew Thomas was suffering because he had protected her. She wanted desperately to help him, but had no idea how. Her husband, Daniel, was furious when he learned the truth, but fear held him back. He knew that confronting Crenshaw would mean his own death. And then what would become of Sarah and their unborn child? Sarah's father, Jacob, took a more cautious view. He was in his 50s, a skilled blacksmith who had lived on the plantation since his teenage years. He had seen overseers come and go, cruel ones and tolerable ones alike. Experience had taught him that survival depended on keeping your head down, doing your work, and waiting. Overseers never stayed forever. Eventually they left, were dismissed, or died. The key was to endure long enough to see them gone. Even Jacob, however, worried about Thomas. The young man was strong, but everyone had a breaking point, and Crenshaw seemed determined to find Thomas's. 3 weeks after the incident in the tobacco barn, Crenshaw escalated his campaign. He announced that Thomas would be whipped for insubordination. The charge was absurd. Thomas had never spoken back, never challenged an order, never done anything except complete every task assigned him. But Crenshaw didn't need a real reason. He only needed an excuse. The whipping was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in the yard between the tobacco barns, where everyone could see it. It was meant as a warning, a demonstration of what happened to those who challenged Crenshaw's authority, even in the smallest way. Ruth was frantic with fear and rage. She went to the main house and begged Edmund Harrove, who was visiting for the weekend, to intervene. Harrove refused. He told her that discipline was the overseer's responsibility and that he would not undermine Crenshaw's authority by interfering. Ruth left the house in tears, knowing there was nothing she could do to stop what was coming. But on Saturday morning, something unexpected happened. Crenshaw woke with a fever. It struck suddenly and violently. One moment he was fine. The next he was burning with heat, shivering uncontrollably despite the summer air. His head throbbed. His stomach churned. He spent the entire day confined to his bed, too sick to stand, too sick to carry out the punishment he had planned. By Sunday, the fever had broken, and Crenshaw felt stronger, but he was also unsettled. He could not understand where the illness had come from or why it had vanished so quickly. He suspected poisoning, but he had no proof and no idea who might have had the opportunity. What he didn't know was that Ruth had slipped a small amount of ipecac root into his coffee on Friday night. The plant grew wild in the woods near Plantation, and Ruth knew how to prepare it. Her own mother had taught her long ago how to use plants for medicine and for other purposes. The ipecac had made Crenshaw violently ill, but it had not killed him. Ruth had been careful with the dose. She did not want him dead. That would have brought too much attention, too many questions. She only wanted to buy Thomas a little more time, but time was running out. Crenshaw was more determined than ever to break Thomas, and he had begun to suspect that someone in the quarters was working against him. He increased his surveillance, watching people closely, searching for signs of resistance or conspiracy. The atmosphere on the plantation grew even more oppressive, more suffocating. People were afraid to speak to one another, afraid to meet each other's eyes, afraid of being accused of crimes they hadn't committed. And Thomas, in the midst of it all, was changing. The others could see it, in the way he moved, in the way he watched Crenshaw when the overseer's back was turned. There was a coldness in Thomas's eyes now, a calculation that hadn't been there before. He was no longer simply enduring. He was planning. Ruth was the first to notice the change. She had always understood Thomas better than anyone. She had raised him, taught him, protected him for 18 years. She knew his fears, his thoughts, his silences, and with a mother's instinct, she knew that something inside him had shifted. It was a Sunday evening in mid-August, about 3 weeks after the incident in the tobacco barn. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in deep oranges and reds, and the air was finally cooling after another brutal day. Ruth found Thomas sitting outside his cabin, staring across the yard at the overseer's cottage. There was something about the stillness of his body, the intensity of his gaze, that unsettled her. She sat down beside him on the wooden step and took his hand. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching the light drain from the sky. Then Ruth gently turned Thomas's face toward hers and signed to him, using the gestures they had shaped together over years. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her hands moving slowly, deliberately. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he signed back, his movements just as calm, just as deliberate. "Fire," he said. "I'm thinking about fire." Ruth felt a shiver run through her despite the warm evening air. She knew her son. She knew he was not speaking in metaphor. When Thomas said he was thinking about fire, he meant it literally. "Don't," she signed, her hands trembling despite her effort to steady them. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. They'll kill you." Thomas shook his head. "They'll kill me anyway," he signed back. "Crenshaw won't stop until I'm dead or broken. You know that." Ruth wanted to argue. She opened her hands, then closed them again, but she couldn't deny it. She had seen too many people destroyed by men like Crenshaw. She had watched bodies fail from overwork, spirits collapse under punishment, lives fade into nothing from despair. And she knew her son was right. Crenshaw would never stop. Men like him couldn't afford to. Their authority rested on fear, and fear only worked if resistance was always punished, always crushed. "What are you going to do?" She signed at last, already afraid of the answer. Thomas looked back toward the overseer's cottage. Lamplight glowed softly in the windows now. Crenshaw was inside, eating his supper, pouring himself whiskey, perhaps already imagining new torments for the next day. "I don't know yet," Thomas signed, "but I'll think of something." And he did. Over the next several days, Thomas thought of little else. He turned the idea over and over in his mind, examining it from every angle, searching for weaknesses, risks, ways it could fail. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that what he was considering was not merely dangerous, it was catastrophic. And yet, he also realized that he had no alternative. Crenshaw had to be stopped. The law would not protect him. Edmund Harrow would not protect him. The other enslaved people could not protect him without placing themselves in terrible danger. Thomas was alone, and that meant he would have to act alone. The plan that slowly formed in his mind was simple at its core, though complicated in execution. Crenshaw had to die, but it could not look like murder. It had to appear accidental, something that raised no suspicion, something that could never be proven otherwise. Fire was the answer. Fire was common on plantations. Lanterns tipped over. Sparks leapt from forges. Summer lightning strikes ignited dry timber. Tobacco barns were especially dangerous. Curing leaves could heat internally, sometimes combusting without warning. A fire in a tobacco barn would not be unusual. And if Crenshaw happened to be inside when it started, if he were trapped, if he died, then it would be tragic, but not criminal. The difficulty lay in timing. Crenshaw would have to be inside the barn at the right moment. The fire would need to spread quickly enough that escape was impossible. Thomas studied the overseer's habits carefully, watching when he made his rounds, when he was alone, when he lingered, when he was careless. He also thought about the consequences. 17 other people lived and worked on Plantation. A fire in the tobacco barn could spread to nearby buildings. Thomas did not want to harm innocent people. He did not want to destroy the cabins, the places that held the only sense of home he had ever known. But he saw no other way. Crenshaw had to be stopped, and this was the only plan with any chance of success. In the end, he decided the fire would have to be set late at night, when most people were asleep. He would start in a way that allowed time for others to escape if the flames spread beyond the barn. It was not a perfect plan. There were too many variables, too many things that could go wrong, but it was the best he could do. What Thomas did not know was that he was not the only person on the plantation thinking about fire. There was a man named Marcus, around 30 years old, who worked in the fields. Marcus had been on the plantation for 5 years, sold there from a North Carolina estate after his previous owner died. He was a quiet man, reserved, someone who kept to himself and avoided close friendships. But he paid attention. He noticed things. He understood power, and he understood resistance. Marcus had been watching Thomas's persecution closely. He had seen how the young deaf man endured everything Crenshaw inflicted on him. How he never complained, never broke, never gave the overseer the satisfaction of seeing him beg. Marcus admired that endurance. He also recognized something familiar in Thomas, something he felt in himself, a willingness to do what had to be done, no matter the cost. Marcus had his own reasons for hating Crenshaw. The overseer had taken a particular dislike to him, though Marcus never fully understood why. Perhaps it was because Marcus was strong and capable and did not show fear. Perhaps it was because Marcus had once lived on a plantation where an overseer had been killed by enslaved workers, and Crenshaw suspected he had been involved. Whatever the reason, Crenshaw had made Marcus's life miserable, assigning him the most punishing labor, cutting his rations, threatening to sell him away from the woman he loved, a woman named Esther who worked in the main house. Marcus had thought about killing Crenshaw for months. He considered poison, a knife in the dark, an accident in the fields. But every option had the same fatal flaw. They would be obvious murders. Marcus would be the obvious suspect. He would be caught, punished, executed, and Esther would be left alone. Then Marcus noticed Thomas staring at the tobacco barn. He saw the look in the young man's eyes and understood immediately. Thomas was planning something, and whatever it was, it involved fire. Marcus decided to wait and watch. If Thomas's plan succeeded, Crenshaw would die and Marcus would not have to risk his own life. If it failed, then Marcus would be forced to act on his own. But for now, waiting was the safest course. There was also a woman named Hannah, about 25 years old, who worked in the kitchen house alongside Ruth. Hannah had been born on the plantation, the daughter of a woman who died when Hannah was 12. She had grown up alongside Thomas and had always felt protective of him, the way an older sister might feel toward a younger brother. She had watched his suffering, persecution with growing anger and fear, and she began to think seriously about what she could do to help him. Hannah knew nothing of Thomas's plan. She knew nothing of Marcus's quiet attention, but she had her own ideas about how to deal with Crenshaw, and those ideas also involved fire. She had been thinking about it for weeks, ever since the day she heard Sarah's frightened voice coming from inside the tobacco barn. Hannah had been walking past the barn toward the main house with a basket of vegetables when she heard the pleading. She had slowed, her heart pounding, every instinct telling her something was wrong. She had wanted to intervene, but fear had rooted her in place. Then Thomas had appeared, and Sarah had escaped. Relief washed over Hannah, followed immediately by shame. Relief that Sarah was safe. Shame that she herself had not been brave enough to act. Since that day, Hannah had thought often about fire. She knew how dry the tobacco barn was, how packed with flammable material. She knew that if a fire started there, it would spread rapidly and be nearly impossible to contain. She knew that if Crenshaw were inside when it happened, he would die, and she knew that no one would ever suspect her. She was only a kitchen worker, someone with no reason to be near the barn, no obvious opportunity to start a blaze. What she didn't know was how to do it without being seen, how to make it look accidental. She was still struggling with those details when Thomas set his own plan in motion. On the evening of August 13th, Thomas saw his chance. Crenshaw had been drinking. That alone was not unusual. The overseer often spent his evenings on his porch with a bottle of whiskey, watching the enslaved workers return from the fields while scribbling notes in the small leather-bound book he carried everywhere. But that night, he had been drinking more than usual. Thomas, working late in the carpenter's shop, watched Crenshaw stagger slightly as he made his way back to his cottage around 9 o'clock. Thomas waited. He waited until the plantation fell quiet, until the last lamps were extinguished in the cabins, until the main house went dark. Edmund Harrow was in Richmond, as he usually was during the week, which meant the only people in the main house were the two elderly women who cleaned and cooked for Harrow when he visited. They would be asleep by now in their small cabin behind the kitchen house. The moon was nearly full, bathing the yard and buildings in pale light. Thomas crossed the yard toward the tobacco barn, his footsteps silent on the packed earth. He had walked this path 1,000 times. He knew every rut and stone, every shadow and sound. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was crossing a line that could never be crossed back. He reached the barn and pulled the door open. The hinges creaked faintly, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Thomas froze, listening. There was no reaction, no movement, no voices. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The barn was dark, but his eyes adjusted quickly. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, casting narrow bands of silver across the floor. The smell of tobacco was overwhelming, sweet, thick, cloying, mixed with dust and the scent of old wood. Thousands of tobacco leaves hung from racks suspended overhead, dry in the warm air, rustling softly as a breeze slipped through the walls. Thomas moved through the space with the ease of familiarity. He knew where every tool was stored, where every supply was kept, where danger lurked. He went to the back of the barn, to the cluttered storage area where Crenshaw kept tools, rope, and miscellaneous supplies. It was a mess: oil-soaked rags, dried straw used for packing, broken boards, empty barrels, coils of rope. Everyone knew it was a fire hazard. No one had ever bothered to clean it. Crenshaw cared about output, not safety. Thomas worked quickly and silently. He gathered the oil-soaked rags and stacked them against the back wall, beneath one of the barn's main support beams. He scattered straw around them, building a nest of kindling. He arranged broken pieces of wood to create a draft, a chimney that would pull flames upward toward the racks of drying tobacco above. He was designing a fire that would begin slowly, but spread fast, a fire that could not be stopped once it took hold. He took a lantern from its hook near the door and lit it using a match from a box Crenshaw kept in the storage area. He set the lantern carefully on the floor beside the pile of rags. He turned the wick higher, making the flame burn hot, then tipped the lantern just enough that oil began to leak, forming a small shimmering pool on the wooden floor. It would take time, 20 minutes, perhaps 30, depending on how fast the oil spread and how hot the lantern burned. Long enough for Thomas to be far away, long enough for it to look like carelessness, a lantern left unattended, oil leaking, a mistake anyone could make. But the plan was not complete. Crenshaw had to be inside the barn when the fire began. Thomas left the barn and walked toward the overseer's cottage. The windows were dark. Crenshaw had gone to bed, likely passed out from drink. Thomas picked up a small stone and hurled it at one of the windows. It struck the glass with a sharp crack. He waited. Nothing. He threw another stone, then another. Each impact echoed through the night like a gunshot. Finally, a lamp flickered to life inside the cottage. Thomas saw Crenshaw's silhouette cross the window, tall, lean, swaying slightly. A moment later, the door flew open. Crenshaw stepped onto the porch holding a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. He wore only trousers and an undershirt, his bare feet on the boards, his hair rumpled. "Who's there?" he shouted, his words slurred with whiskey. "Show yourself or I'll shoot." Thomas stepped into the lantern's glow, lifting his hands to show he was unarmed. He pointed urgently toward the tobacco barn, then gestured wildly, his face twisted with apparent panic, his mouth moving as if he were trying and failing to speak. Crenshaw squinted at him, irritation and suspicion mixing on his face as he tried to understand what the deaf young man was trying to say. At him, trying to understand. What are you trying to say, boy?" Thomas pointed again, more urgently now, then began walking toward the tobacco barn. He glanced back over his shoulder. beckoning Crenshaw to follow, his movements growing more frantic, more desperate with each step. Crenshaw hesitated. He was drunk, suspicious, and he trusted Thomas about as far as he could throw him. But he was also responsible for the plantation in Edmund Hero's absence. If something was wrong in the tobacco barn, if there was damage to the crop, theft, or worse, a fire, he would be held accountable. He could not afford to ignore a warning, even if it came from someone he despised. "This better not be a trick," he muttered, following Thomas across the yard. He kept the pistol aimed at Thomas's back, his finger resting on the trigger, ready to fire if the young man tried anything. They reached the barn, and Thomas pulled the door open. Inside, everything appeared normal. Rows of tobacco leaves hung neatly from the racks, swaying gently in the faint breeze from the open door. There was no visible flame, no smell of smoke, only the familiar sense of dried tobacco, dust, and old wood. Crenshaw stepped inside, lifting his lantern higher. "What the hell are you playing at?" he snapped. "There's nothing here." Thomas pointed toward the rear of the barn, toward the cluttered storage area. His expression remained panicked, his gestures insistent. Crenshaw walked in that direction, his boots thudding against the wooden floor, his lantern throwing restless shadows along the walls. Thomas did not follow. Instead, he stepped back outside and pulled the door shut. A thick wooden beam rested beside the entrance, normally used during winter to keep animals out. Thomas lifted it and dropped it into place across the door, securing it from the outside. Inside, Crenshaw shouted. Thomas heard him run back toward the door and begin pounding on it, his fists slamming against the wood. Thomas turned away. He walked calmly back toward his cabin, his face blank in the moonlight. Behind him, in the storage area at the rear of the barn, the leaking lantern finally ignited the pool of oil on the floor. Flames flared outward, catching the oil-soaked rags, the dried straw, the broken wood. Within moments, the fire climbed the back wall, reaching up toward the racks of cured tobacco. The leaves ignited like paper. Embers floated upward toward the roof as the fire spread sideways along the racks, racing to the barn, consuming everything in its path. Crenshaw smelled smoke before he saw flame. He stopped pounding on the door and spun around, his lantern swinging wildly. At the far end of the barn, an orange glow pulsed and grew brighter by the second, accompanied by a roaring sound like wind tearing through trees, the sound of fire devouring dry wood and tobacco. He ran toward the back of the barn, believing he could stop it before it spread. But by the time he reached the storage area, the flames were already too high, too hot. He tried stamping them out with his boots, but the fire had reached the tobacco leaves, which burned instantly, shedding embers that drifted upward toward the ceiling. The heat was overwhelming. Smoke thickened, black and choking, searing his lungs, blinding his eyes. Crenshaw ran back to the door and hurled himself against it. The beam held. He screamed for help, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the fire. Smoke filled the barn now, dense and suffocating. The heat scorched his skin. Flames crawled across the ceiling, devouring support beams. He searched frantically for another escape. Small windows lined the upper walls, but they were too high to reach without a ladder and too narrow to squeeze through. The loading door to the back was chained and padlocked from the outside. He was trapped. The fire accelerated, racing along the walls, consuming dry tobacco, wooden racks, and structural beams alike. Every breath burned his lungs. Tears streamed from his eyes as smoke poured in. His skin blistered under the relentless heat. He made one final attempt to break the door, slamming his shoulder into it again and again until pain exploded through his arm and he could barely lift it. And then, through the smoke and flame, he saw something that froze his blood. Near the back of the barn, just beyond the reach of the firelight, stood a figure, a young man with dark eyes, a face completely devoid of emotion. Thomas. It was impossible. Thomas had been outside. Thomas had locked him in. Thomas could not be inside the barn. Crenshaw blinked hard, trying to clear the smoke from his eyes. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Had it ever been there at all? Or was it only smoke, fear, and whiskey twisting his mind in his final moments? He would never know. The roof collapsed seconds later, sending a cascade of burning debris and sparks crashing down. Crenshaw had time for one last scream before the flames swallowed him completely. Thomas was sitting on the steps of his cabin when the barn gave way. He felt the impact of the ground beneath him and watched as a column of sparks shot into the sky like a fountain of fire. Around him, doors flew open. People spilled from their cabins, shouting, pointing, their faces lit by the orange glow. Within minutes, the entire plantation was awake. A bucket brigade formed from the well to the burning barn, hands passing water desperately from person to person. But it was useless. The fire was too large, too fierce. All they could do was try to keep it from spreading to nearby buildings. In the chaos, Ruth found Thomas. She seized his arm and pulled him close, her eyes searching his face. She did not need to ask whether he had done this. She could see the truth in his eyes. "Where is Crenshaw?" she signed, her hands trembling. Thomas pointed toward the burning barn. Ruth's face drained the color. "Is he?" Thomas nodded. For a moment, Ruth simply stared at him, her thoughts racing. Then she made a decision. She pulled Thomas toward the main house, where one of the elderly women who cared for it stood on the porch, watching the fire with wide, terrified eyes. "We need to send someone to Richmond," Ruth said, "to tell Mr. Harrow what happened. Thomas will go." The woman nodded, too stunned to question it. Ruth turned back to Thomas and signed rapidly, urgency filling every movement. "Go. To Richmond now. Tell Mr. Harrow there was a fire. Tell him you don't know where Mr. Crenshaw is. Stay in Richmond until tomorrow. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded. He understood exactly what she was doing. Ruth was giving him an alibi, a reason to be miles away when the fire began. If anyone asked, he had been sent to Richmond to fetch Edmund Harrow. He could not have set the fire because he had not been there. Thomas left at once, walking down the road toward Richmond under cover darkness, the orange glow of the burning barn slowly fading behind him. He walked for nearly 3 hours before reaching the outskirts of the city. There, he found a small grove of trees near the road and waited for dawn. Back at the plantation, the fire burned through the night. By morning, the tobacco bar was nothing more than a smoking ruin, a collapsed skeleton of charred beams and ash. The surrounding buildings had been saved, but the bar itself was gone, along with the entire tobacco crop that had been curing inside. And somewhere beneath the wreckage, buried under burned leaves and fallen timbers, lay the body of Virgil Crenshaw. Edmund Harrow arrived at the plantation around noon on August 14th, summoned by Thomas, who had found him at his Richmond townhouse early that morning. Harrow was stunned by what he saw. The barn reduced to ash, the season's crop destroyed, and his overseer dead. 3 days later, the county sheriff arrived to investigate. His name was William Foster, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and a practical, no-nonsense manner. He had served as sheriff for 2 decades and had investigated dozens of plantation fires across the county. Most had been accidents, lanterns tipped over, sparks from forges, lightning strikes. A few had been deliberate acts of resistance, but those were usually obvious. The perpetrators were rarely subtle. Foster questioned Edmund Harrow first, asking about plantation operations, Crenshaw's habits, and any recent disputes. Harrow told him Crenshaw had been an effective overseer, that tobacco yields had risen significantly under his management, and that he was unaware of any serious problems. Foster then interviewed Ruth. She told him that Thomas had seen Crenshaw enter the tobacco barn with a lantern on the night of the fire. Thomas, she said, had been working late in the carpenter's shop and noticed Crenshaw stumbling slightly, as if drunk. Minutes later, smoke had begun pouring from the barn. Thomas ran for help, but by the time anyone arrived, the fire was already out of control. Ruth explained that she had then sent Thomas to Richmond to fetch Mr. Harrow. Several other enslaved people were interviewed and their stories aligned. Crenshaw had been drinking. He had gone into the barn to check the tobacco. Somehow, a fire had started. Tragic, yes, but not unusual. Foster examined the ruins personally, sifting through the ash in search of clues. Near the point of origin, he found the twisted remains of a lantern, which supported the theory that Crenshaw had dropped or overturned it. Crenshaw's body was burned beyond recognition, identifiable only by the pistol he had carried and the brass buttons from his coat. Foster filed his report and closed the case. The fire, he concluded, was an accident caused by an overturned lantern. Virgil Crenshaw had died in the line of duty while attempting to protect his employer's property. It was unfortunate, but there was no evidence of foul play. Crenshaw was buried in the Plantation cemetery in an unmarked grave that would be forgotten within a generation. Edmund Harrove hired a new overseer, a milder man named Robert Hayes, who did not employ Crenshaw's brutal methods. The tobacco crop was a complete loss, but Harrove carried insurance and rebuilt the barn. A new crop was planted the following spring. Life on the plantation returned, outwardly, to something resembling normal. Work resumed, fields were tended, animals fed, buildings repaired. But something fundamental had shifted. There was a quiet sense of possibility now, a feeling that the old order could be challenged, that men like Crenshaw were not invincible. Then, 3 weeks after the fire, something strange happened. Another fire broke out on the plantation, this time in one of the slave cabins. It was small and quickly extinguished, but it rattled everyone. The cabin belonged to a man named Peter, one of Crenshaw's former favorites, a man who would inform on others in exchange for small privileges. The fire had started in the middle of the night while Peter slept. He woke to find his mattress smoldering and managed to put out before it spread. The message was unmistakable. Informers were not safe. A week later, another fire, this one in the kitchen house. Again, it was contained before serious damage occurred. But the pattern was clear now. Someone was setting fires, and they were targeting specific people, specific places. Edmund Harrove began to believe the plantation was cursed. He spent more time in Richmond, leaving day-to-day operations to Robert Hayes. Hayes, however, was nervous. He had heard the stories about Crenshaw, about how he died, and he had no desire to share that fate. He treated the enslaved people cautiously, avoiding the cruelty that had made his predecessors so hated. The fires continued, always small, always controlled, never devastating, but always appearing where no one expected them. Whispers spread through the quarters. Some said it was Crenshaw's ghost, returned to haunt the land. Others claimed it was divine punishment for the sins committed there. But a few people, Ruth, Marcus, Hannah, knew the truth, or at least suspected it. One evening after supper, Ruth confronted Thomas. She pulled him aside, her hands trembling with fear and anger as she signed to him. "You have to stop. They're going to figure it out. They're going to know it's you." Thomas looked at her with the same calm, watchful eyes. "I'm not setting fires," he signed. "Don't lie to me." Ruth signed back. "I know what you did to Crenshaw. I know what you're doing now. You have to stop before they catch you." Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he signed. "I'm not setting the fires, but I'm not stopping them either." At first, Ruth didn't understand. Then the meaning settled in, heavy and terrifying. The fires weren't Thomas's work. They were being set by others, Marcus, Hannah, and perhaps more. People who had seen what happened to Crenshaw and realized that fire could be used as a weapon, a language of resistance. Thomas hadn't started a rebellion. He had started an idea. And once an idea takes root, it is almost impossible to extinguish. Marcus had set the fire in Peter's cabin, a warning to informers. Hannah had set the fire in the kitchen house, a reminder that even the heart of the plantation was not beyond reach. And there were others, too, people with their own grievances, their own scars, their own reasons for striking back at a system built to crush them. They were careful. The fires were small, controlled, never catastrophic. They were meant to speak, not to destroy. And the message was unmistakable. We are not powerless. We can fight back. By the spring of 1860, Edmund Harrove had had enough. He sold the plantation to a buyer from North Carolina and moved permanently to Richmond. The new owner lasted less than a year before selling it again. Unable to cope with the recurring fires, the constant unease, the sense that the land itself resisted control, the plantation changed hands 3 more times before the Civil War erupted in 1861. By the war's end in 1865, the main house had burned as well, another mysterious fire, this one large enough to consume the entire structure. The property was abandoned, the land divided and sold off in pieces. Thomas lived to see emancipation. He was 24 when the war ended. Still young, still strong, still watchful. He left Virginia and traveled north, eventually settling in Philadelphia, where he found work as a carpenter. He married a woman named Clara, who was also deaf, and together they raised 3 children. He built a good life for himself, a free life, one he could never have imagined as a young man on the Harrow Plantation. He never spoke about what happened on the night of August 14, 1859. He never told anyone how he had locked Virgil Crenshaw inside the burning barn. He carried that secret for the rest of his life. When Thomas died in 1903 at the age of 62, the truth went with him. But the story did not die. It survived in whispers, passed down to the descendants of those who have been enslaved to Harrow Plantation, told quietly in kitchens and parlors, retold until it became something suspended between history and legend. Some versions claim Thomas possessed supernatural powers, that he could summon fire with his mind. Others said he had made a pact with the devil. The oldest versions, the ones closest to the truth, said something far simpler. They said Thomas was a young man who had been pushed too far, a man who had witnessed too much cruelty, a man who decided that if the law would not give him justice, he would take it himself. The land where the Harrow Plantation once stood still exists in Virginia's Tidewater region, about 40 miles south of Richmond. The main house is gone. The tobacco barns are gone. The slave cabins are gone. All that remains is a half-buried stone foundation swallowed by weeds and a small cemetery where Virgil Crenshaw's unmarked grave has long since been forgotten. Yet on certain nights, when the wind is just right, nearby residents claim they can still smell smoke. And sometimes if you stand very still and listen closely, you can hear the sound of someone pounding on a door, desperate to escape, his cries swallowed by the roar of flames. This story reminds us that history is never as simple as it appears in textbooks. The line between victim and perpetrator, between justice and revenge, is often blurred beyond recognition. Thomas was a young man denied every form of protection, every form of justice, every acknowledgement of his humanity. And so he took control in the only way he knew how. Was he justified, or did he become the very thing he was fighting against? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions each of us must answer for ourselves. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Thomas was justified, or did his actions cross a line that should never be crossed? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more dark historical mysteries like this one, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves unsettling history. See you in the next one.